ever happen to catch the trailer for something and it immediately 100% grabs you? Something about the visuals or the sound or something just makes you want to know more and guarantees that you will eagerly be watching it on the day it premieres?
Your body is not who you are. You shed it like a snake sheds its skin. We transfer the human consciousness between bodies to live eternal life.
When I saw the trailer for the first season of Netflix's Altered Carbon, I knew I was going to watch it in its entirety as soon as it came out. It had enough of a cyberpunk vibe to grab me, sort of reminded me of Blade Runner or Ghost in the Shell, but with a modern feel. And the central issue at the heart of this tech noir series was having to solve the murder of a guy who was very much not dead? Color me intrigued. And I absolutely was not disappointed by that season. Anyone and everyone gets it as a recommendation from me. I don't care what genres you're interested in, you should watch this. I was not alone in these feelings apparently, because Netflix greenlit a second season pretty fast with a release date that was uncomfortably close. And word got out that they were going to focus on the third book of the remaining two, which made sense given what they had sort of done story-wise and what the stories were in those two books. And second season came out and I watched it, and I would recommend that you don't do the same. Let me tell you why. This video made possible thanks to viewers and patrons like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to the channel. So this video is a bit of a breather video for me. Doing a week of fluffier and easier content so I can switch off the lobster brain and recover from Peterson. Easier. This video is far more in-depth than I had anticipated at the outset. And seeing as how I actually fired up Twitter and had a series of angry tweets about this, which is something I don't typically do, I wanted to expand on that a bit. I want to get my opinion on this out there to potentially save someone the hours of their life it would take to watch this series. That's how much I don't like the second season of Altered Carbon. The Altered Carbon books are the product of Richard Morgan, an author from the UK, and the TV series was produced by Netflix. I do need to acknowledge up front that I might have a source of bias here, and that's the order that I consumed the assorted content in. So I started with the season 1 on Netflix, then read all 3 of the books, and finished those about a year and a half ago, and then just recently saw season 2. And so because I went into the first season not having read the books, it might have changed my opinion somehow in how I'm viewing the 2 seasons. Some of the complaints I have about the second season, I think I would have regardless in just comparing the 2 seasons, but I just wanted to get that out of the way here. In order for me to really talk about my problems with the second season, I'm going to be spoiling everything. The first season, second season, all 3 of the books, because there's a lot of problems with the second season and a lot of sources for those problems. So if you're interested in going into this content unspoiled, I'd recommend that you pause the video, go watch the first season, read the books maybe if you want to read the books, and then come back and then we can talk about the second season, because you really shouldn't watch the second season. So the final caveat before we get this show on the road: in addition to not being a counseling psychologist or geneticist, I'm also not a trained or professional media critic. I've watched a lot of Folding Ideas and Lindsay Ellis, but beyond that, I have no training in this other than watching a lot of media, especially like cyberpunk stuff. So I might be talking about things where I don't really have the appropriate term for why something isn't feeling right, and I might also get something wrong. So if this is your area of expertise and I make you cringe, let me know. I would love to learn. Finally, usual YouTuber stuff. Like, comment, subscribe. You can check out my Patreon, link in the description box, for the fun little thing that I'm doing for the 1-year anniversary of the channel. And additionally, given how some other reviewers' experience with Netflix products go, like cynical reviews for example, I'm fully expecting this video to be copyright claimed. So if you would like to see content like this in the future, or content like I normally make, hit me up on Patreon. And yeah, here's why you shouldn't watch season 2 of Altered Carbon. Let's start this with a brief and general enough plot synopsis that should cover the first book and the first season. Sometime in the future, people have spread to distant planets, and while there, discovered the ruins of an advanced but dead civilization. Some of the technology found was used to help produce what are called stacks, which allow for a person's consciousness to be digitized, then downloaded, uploaded, transferred, etc. Death itself has been redefined by this technology. In theory, a person could continue on living as long as they can afford the new bodies, which are ever so lovingly referred to as sleeves. In practice, this is only really done by the uber-rich, as it is a very costly thing to undertake. At some point there had been a rebellion on Harlan's world, one of the colonized planets, that tried to fight against the widespread adoption of this technology, as it was predicted to make the divide between the wealthy and the poor even greater. This rebellion ended when the leader, Calcrest Falconer, was killed. For permanent, real death to occur, a person's stack has to be destroyed. Of course, the wealthy have a way around this, as they can back up their personal data file to what is basically the cloud. Much to a certain frog reproductive activist horror, there is basically one government in charge of everything. The United Nations Protectorate, also called the UN, also called the Protectorate. They allow some autonomy in the outer worlds, as long as things don't get too rowdy. If things are starting to get heated somewhere or going against the Protectorate's wishes, they will dispatch their super special military to the place. They're called envoys in the book, SeaTac in the show. These are soldiers who are extensively trained in combat, psychologically conditioned to do harm, and be better able to read people in situations, and be able to re-sleeve quickly and repeatedly. Because if things are going sideways somewhere, at least as far as the government's concerned, you need to have boots on the ground yesterday. The only way to do that is with soldiers who are able to hop between planets and bodies at a moment's notice. When we joined the story on Earth, the UN had just not passed a bill that would have allowed the police to spin up murder victims to have them provide evidence on their murder. On Earth, the Catholic Church has grown in influence and has taken the stance that we only get one life. Being spun up for any reason after your body dies guarantees you will be going to hell. As such, they were strongly against this bill. The people who follow these beliefs have a religious coding in their person file so that the spinning up post-death won't happen for them, and this is what the bill was trying to get around. Our main character is Takeshi Kovacs, and he was born on Harlan's world, same planet that had that rebellion. He enlisted in the United Nations Super Special Soldiers, which gave him the badass training. At some point, he'd had enough of the job and left. Misadventures happen, and he ends up on ICE, which is the future version of prison. Basically, your file is in storage for however long your sentence is. Kovacs is brought out of prison and back to Earth by an incredibly wealthy and powerful guy, Lawrence Bancroft, to figure out who killed him by blowing out his stack. Something that would have really killed a non-1%er. The police detective on the case, Ortega, believes it was suicide. During the investigation, Kovacs is blackmailed into providing Bancroft with a convincing but wrong answer by someone who is up to her ears in shady dealings, Raylene. Raylene? In the show they say Raylene, or Ray, but I read it as Raylene because it looks like Eileen, so I don't know. We'll see what pops out of my mouth. Raylene has an assassin in her employ who screws with Kovacs and other characters to get them acting in line with what she wants. Kovacs acquiesces, spins a false narrative, and gets Raylene to believe the case is closed. Towards the end, Kovacs and friends put together that Raylene was running a brothel that serviced the elite clientele, and part of the services offered, that wasn't advertised online, was the ability to kill the prostitute that they were sleeping with. But murder is still frowned upon, so Raylene needed Bancroft to use his considerable influence in the UN to block the spinning up murder victims bill. He wouldn't do it, so she arranged a situation where he killed a prostitute, so Raylene would have the needed leverage over him. By the way, Raylene had her prostitutes religiously coded without their knowledge or consent, so this service could continue. Between the guilt of actually killing a person, something he didn't think he could do, and helping Raylene, Bancroft blew his stack out so he'd lose those memories, reverting to the last backup prior to those events. By the story's end, the brothel is raided, the assassin is killed, Kovacs gets Raylene to confess while being recorded, and the whole place is destroyed, along with Raylene. Bancroft's involvement sort of comes out, there's a special investigation into the whole thing, and the UN murder victim bill passes. And we leave the story with Kovac trying to get Needlecast, his file transferred, back to Harlan's world. Let's talk about the easier things first. The feel of the first season was definitely in keeping with the golden age of television. The world felt real and big, and there were a couple times I think I spotted a set being recycled or shot from a different angle, but for the most part I was immersed. The digital effects enhanced the shots without drawing attention to themselves. The technology shown felt natural in universe and didn't seem forced or out of place. The music felt bespoke, and the action scenes and fight choreography were interesting and creative without being cheesy. The acting, for the most part, was good. I'd never really seen the main cast in anything before, so this was my first experience with them. And yes, that does mean I had avoided Suicide Squad. For the main example, I thought Kinnaman did a good job portraying someone who'd had the more human parts burned out of him, but was still trying to be a decent person. I also thought that the supporting cast did a bang-up job, especially the guy who went from skinhead—
Moms look like you, huh? Why don't you tap me in so I can get a look-see? Maybe schedule my first mother-daughter three-way when I get out of here.
to abuela,
Ay, cálmate, Alasne. It's like you've never seen a tattoo before.
to Russian operative.
I have rights, you know.
Who do you work for, Timmy?
Hoping for a confession, Lieutenant. Elias Reich, or whoever you are, you could be anyone. A cunning SeaTac agent. Eta gruba.
Related to this, the lighting design, cinematography, and directing were excellent. There was variety from the standard shots or angles used. Like, conversations weren't always just shot reverse shot. There seemed to be care in how the shots were composed. The light composition can be stunning and reinforce what's happening in the scene. Kovac feels alone and separate from the world. His color doesn't match the rest of the scene. Also on the back end of things, for me the writing worked. The dialogue didn't seem clunky or too expositional, and a lot of times details were conveyed subtly. And I feel like the attentive viewer would be rewarded with these subtle little details that would become big important plot things later on. As I mentioned earlier, I watched the first season before I read the first book, and so that might bias or sway my interpretation here. But I think that a lot of the changes that they made from the book to adapt it for the TV show made sense. And I'll talk about a couple of the examples as we go through as an example of good adaptation choices. First, there's a difference in when Kovac was born between the book and the TV show. And this really impacts the story that ends up being told. So in the book, he was born a couple hundred years after that rebellion on Harlan's world that was led by Calcrest Falconer. And so in the book, Calcrest's philosophy is still floating around and used by people, and so it does sort of come up sometimes for Kovac, but it's sort of just part of his education more than anything. And when he spun up on Earth, he'd only been imprisoned for maybe 20 years. And in the TV show, he was part of the rebellion. He knew Calcrest Falconer, like, he knew Kel as a person and not just something that was taught in school. And so instead of being imprisoned for something like 20 years, he was on ice for like 200. It gives us an audience surrogate, as Kovac has been on ice for a long time and off-world. He needs a lot of the nitty-gritties of day-to-day life explained to him. It allows for Kovac to have known and grown close to Calcrest Falconer, leader of the rebellion, who they built up as his tragic love interest, while her philosophy was just sort of floating around in the book. It also lets them streamline the character list, more on that in a second. It also allows for him to have been part of the Kellis Rebellion and flesh out that part of the universe a bit, which also serves to highlight the big theme of this series. This sort of technology can end up being something that makes the class divide much greater, and the cost of life for the poor is that much less valued. One thing I'm sort of mixed on here, though, is the consequent redefinition of the super special soldiers. So in the book, the envoys were the UN Protectorate soldiers, not the rebels under Kel. And there was a fair bit of distrust for book envoys because of the training they'd gone through and directives they had carried out in the name of serving the monolithic government. This can be a bit awkward at times in the series. For one, naming these super soldiers as envoys in the books was a deliberately ironic bit of naming. Envoys are supposed to be diplomatic messengers, not armed enforcers. But calling the rebel forces envoys doesn't really make sense, other than carrying that cool-sounding title forward. Next, we're going to talk about some changes to some of the characters, starting with Kel. And in order to talk about the changes to Kel, I need to talk about the book characters Virginia Vidara and Sarah. Vidara was the envoy trainer for Kovac, and at some point prior to the first book, she retired from the military and went freelance. Of note here, though, is she is the one who provided the combat mantras for Kovac. A weapon, any weapon, is a tool, she told us. Cradled in her arms was a Sunjet particle gun. Designed for a specific purpose, just as any tool is, and only useful in that purpose. You would think a man a fool to carry a force hammer with him everywhere simply because he's an engineer. And as it is with engineers, so it is doubly with envoys.
This slave is a tool. It does not control me. I control it. This is the weakness of weapons. They are tools to kill and destroy. They are not what gives you power.
Vidara has a somewhat similar role to the non-romantic plot points of Kel in the series. She is the one who teaches Kovac the non-Jedi ways. She's the voice in his head reminding him of the relevant lessons. Given the other changes they made to Kovac's background and the retooling of Kel's character, it makes sense to streamline the training bits into Kel. Plus, Kovac had a bit of a lusty crush on Vidara during training, so there's that too. Some other parts of Vidara's role are taken up by Season 1's Jaeger. He was who recruited Kovac in the series into SeaTac, and so trained him. He's also the one who real deathed our next character. If you've seen the first season, you'd know Sarah as the chick who had her stack blown out in the first episode. In the books, Sarah wasn't real deathed at that point, just jailed. And Kovac and Sarah had a pretty serious relationship, and arguably, she's the one he holds a candle for, even if they had a hard time getting back together after that. That said, their relationship wasn't really portrayed as this epic romantic love story. Kovac and the other envoys, in the books at least, have sort of had that burned out of them, and so they aren't really that type of people anymore. But that sort of detachment can make a protagonist unlikable. And apparently we audiences prefer having love stories in our things. I'm not taking a swing at anyone here, it just seems like producers aren't happy unless there's a marketable love story happening there. Joining up the love interestness of Sarah with the leader of the Kel's rebellion means that the time that would have been needed on two characters can be spent on one, which leads to better development of one character. It also sort of determines what the future stories can be about, though. Giving Kovac more investment in the rebellion and a personal stake in how their missions went was more engaging. The place he was at emotionally at the start of the series makes sense given what he'd been through with the fall of the rebellion. On top of that, a big fiery defeat is more shiny than Kovac eventually sort of just retiring out of the envoys. Speaking of, let's talk about Raylene, bringer of the fiery defeat in the series. The addition of Kovac's sister as a character who did things beyond just a vague person in the background gives the story a little bit more grounding and makes some of the events easier to understand and suspend disbelief for than if the book had been directly copied. In the book, Kovac's family wasn't really given much time, other than his dad getting a new body at one point and slipping off never to return, so they weren't really developed as characters. Raylene, the big bad of the book, had a history with Kovac that was tied up in underworld dealings, which made sense for the Kovac of the book. For example, Sarah was used as leverage against him instead of Ortega, but given the different development of the Kovac character and his involvement in the rebellion, that criminal underground angle doesn't really make sense anymore. By making Raylene Kovac's sister, who he thought had been killed at the end of the rebellion, their interactions are easier to grok, starting at relief and shock that she was alive at all, before moving into disgust as the extent of what Raylene has done and why is revealed. In the series, they were able to give Kovac a bit of vulnerability and humanity through his relationship with his sister. The final showdown between the two has much more emotional weight given Raylene's reasons behind her actions and Kovac's response to those, as opposed to just needing to make sure a monstrous person didn't get to continue what she was doing. The final character I'll talk about is the assassin. So in the books, this was a woman named Trep who had a wicked, twisted sense of humor, was fiercely loyal to Raylene, but in the final showdown, tried to help Kovacs against Raylene, but was killed by her. In the show, the assassin was a guy named Loom. He didn't have much in the way of personality besides being fanatical about his living god Raylene. Ortega got the chance to kill him in the climax. I can't say I know why they made this change. Maybe it was to emphasize an idea that the uber-rich would functionally be like a god at that point, and so would have fanatics willing to do anything for them, which Trep didn't really do cleanly. I do know that some fans of the books were unhappy that Trep wasn't in the first season. This point will come up again later. And finally, Kovacs' motivation is slightly different between the book and the TV show. So in the book, he hadn't been part of the Kellist Rebellion, so he doesn't have that kind of culty vibe that he does in the show. But his reasons for picking up this murder investigation weren't really laid out. Just that he couldn't really say no, and the money plus exoneration would be nice. By the end, Kovacs got his money and is going back to Harlan's world. It's not written that he's going there for Sarah, so it's unclear if that was the intent or not. In the show, given his rebellion background, he has to be thoroughly convinced that he helped out a super rich guy. He was perfectly content to go back into storage. And at the end of the series, he has hope that Kel is still alive and he's going to go try to find her. As with most of the other things, this change makes sense in the context of how they changed Kovacs' backstory and character. So yeah, the first season felt properly cinematic, the characters and the world felt real enough, and the changes made from the source material to the adaptation helped make it cohesive. One of the central themes, that this technology could further divide the social classes, comes through loud and clear. I'm honestly torn on what the best way to continue from here is, given how completely different the second season is from the books. So let's summarize the books, especially the relevant points for the second season, and then talk about the second season. Broken Angel is the follow-up to Altered Carbon, and we start with Kovacs as he fights in what appears to be an unwinnable civil war. This one is less punk noir, more action sci-fi. Kovacs is a part of Carrera's Wedge, which is a mercenary group who is currently fighting for the government, and they wear sleeves that have been genetically modified to promote pack-like behavior with wolf DNA. They are fighting against a group led by a guy named Kemp, who is trying to overthrow the government to install something more democratic. Kovacs isn't really too keen on this war because it is an absolute meat grinder, so as soon as the opportunity comes up to do anything else, he takes it. There's a potential alien tech finding at an archaeological site that is laying unclaimed because of the war, so Kovacs is brought in to help claim this because those are worth loads of money. In addition to the only surviving archaeologist, Kovacs builds a team from people who were killed during the war, whose stacks were sort of salvaged and are now for sale in bulk. The team arrive at the site, and the tech was a wormhole portal thing to some undetermined region in space. The archaeologist gets the portal open again, team goes to space, and find an alien spaceship in what appears to be a stable cometary orbit. While they're exploring it and trying to set up the beacon, a second alien spaceship, seemingly not from the same species of alien as they'd been used to, passes by. The automated systems of the ship Kovacs and company are on spring to life because this other ship is firing at it. Eventually, one of the attacks gets through the shields and the ship screamed. There are some song spires on the ship, and those are the weird alien tree things that nobody really knows what they do. So these song spires on the ship somehow stored the collective grief and anguish of the dead aliens and was playing it back during the attacks. This was overwhelming for the people on board, so Kovacs trank guns the team before passing out himself. Kovacs wakes up back at the dig site in the care of Carrera and his team. It's found out that one of Kovacs' team was deemed traitor for fragging his commanding officer. In the initial team building, Kovacs talked to him about it and didn't disagree with the CEO being offed, hence this guy's spot on the team. Carrera sets up a particularly nasty way for this guy to be killed, a very slow, tech-enhanced version of vivisection. and has Kovac incapacitated so he can't interfere. Kovac envoys his way out of the incapacitation, gathers who can fight from his team, and then proceeds to kill everyone they can of Carrera's group, with his sleeves pack instinct fighting and protesting the whole time. Carrera himself gets away through the portal, but Kovac follows him, epic fight, Kovac wins. The group is able to sell the rights to the ship to a merchant, and the story ends with Kovac heading to a place called Latimer. Plot twist, Kovac was working for the Kellis, and those are the people who are carrying on with Kel's rebellion, who are going to want to know what the fuck he was doing that whole time. A big theme for this book was that corporations are going to act in their own best interests, even at the expense of human life. As with the first book, the lives of the little people are not really more than a statistic. Woken Furies starts off with Kovac finishing an assassination and trying not to get found by the law enforcement on Harlan's world. He manages to get help from a DCOM command head named Sylvie, who slips him into her team. DCOM, meaning decommissioning of some military hardware that got loose. Of the thinking and adapting gray goo kind of hardware. Command head, meaning she's got implants connecting her to her crew. If you played Anthem, this is sort of like the ciphers from that game. Kind of. But instead of an innate gift and hardware you have to sit in, you get brain implants that let you work wirelessly. If you didn't play Anthem, and I can't say I blame you for not, the command head is the wet dream of a networked battlefield. The command head is able to communicate with any and all team members, see what they're seeing, get recon data from passing satellites, and so forth. She's essentially the coordinator and director for their missions. They go out on a mission, find some abandoned top-end sleeves, which Kovac and another of Sylvie's group take. These sleeves are top-of-the-line combat models with fun things like gecko-enhanced grip to hang on to things really super well. At some point, Sylvie passes out, and eventually another personality seems to take control of her sleeve. Eventually, they figure out that it's none other than Kel Crest Falconer. Basically, when Kel had been killed originally, her rebellion was at the verge of being destroyed. In a last-ditch effort to save their leader, she was sent up in a balloon. But you have to be careful on Harlan's world, because there are leftover alien orbital satellites that destroy anything that gets within distance of them, above or below. The original colony ship, as well as spaceships coming or going, are able to go through a region where the orbitals are mysteriously gone. Kel's escape balloon got too close, and she got vaporized. Except that the satellites upload the consciousness of the organism being destroyed. Sylvie had accidentally gotten infected by Kel's file while virtually poking around the satellites. Meanwhile, the Harlans, for whom the planet is named, acquired a backup of Kovac from when he was still with the envoys. They spin him up and give him a combat sleeve to go after himself because reasons. I can't remember and I'm not easily finding it. If you happen to know, stick it in a comment and I'll pin it. There are some things going on that could be part of the reason though. For one, Kovac is on a roaring rampage of revenge against a fundamentalist religious group that's been gaining in popularity on Harlan's world. This group mandates that women be appropriately covered, among other things. Sarah, love interest from earlier, wouldn't, and so she and her daughter were publicly executed, and their stacks were tossed into the ocean. Kovac is systematically going through and getting the stacks of people responsible for or involved with her death. Then he gives these stacks to a guy running a dogfighting thing, who will sleeve these religious guys into dogs for fights. For two, members of the first families have been getting killed by seemingly random people. Turns out that this was a Kellis bioweapon of sorts. They engineered some of their own to be potentially instinctively murderous around the Harlans. Like a Harlan family member's pheromones would trigger an insatiable urge to kill the person emitting that scent. These engineered individuals would pass the trait on to their kids, and so forth. This trait would lay dormant until triggered by a virus, which got out when the covert sites holding the sleeves with the virus were taken by the Yakuza. Kovac splits up from Sylvie and company to try and draw those who are pursuing them off. It sort of works, with a Kovac off that results in modern Kovac hanging from the side of a cliff thanks to the gecko palms. But Sylvie's group is still found, decimated, and Sylvie is captured by the Harlans. Kovac enlists the help of Vidara, his envoy trainer from way back when, along with the others that she's currently running with. They get Sylvie back, but it's a short-lived victory as the base they were at is attacked by a double agent. Things are looking pretty bleak for them, but then Sylvie/Kel are able to use the defensive satellites to take out almost everyone at the scene. Then Clone Kovac, or Clone Vach, attacks. Fight, fight, fight. Modern Kovac gets the upper hand, but decides not to kill Clone Vach. Kovac tells Clone Vach to stop talking shit about him and do a better job himself of living his life. Clone Vach starts to walk off, even a little grateful maybe, but is killed by someone else who had survived the fight. The story ends with the Harlans being in turtle mode because of the rapidly spreading virus. Sylvie and Kel are able to coexist in Sylvie's body, and they're working on communicating better with the orbital satellites. They're hoping to be able to overthrow the Harlan's oligarchy, chase out the Yakuza and the UN Protectorate, and set up a world governed by its own people. The last lines of the book focus on Kovac hoping that maybe when they're able to really control the satellites, Sarah and her daughter's stacks can be found. The previous book's themes seem less pronounced in this one, but there's still this idea that the powerful will jealously guard their position at all costs. So, those are the other two books that Netflix could have potentially worked from. What did they do, and why am I not happy with it? I'm going to mirror how I talked about the first season, so let's start with the plot synopsis. Kovac is forcibly hired by a Harlan's World founding family member to protect him because the other people who founded the world are turning up with a case of the super deads. The hiring guy entices Kovac with knowledge about where Kel is. Kovac comes to in his new sleep just as the guy who hired him is dying from some mysterious thing that burns out stacks, making them super dead. Figuring he'd be blamed for the pile of corpses around him, Kovac goes to the Yakuza head for a place to stay, which he is granted. P.S. This Yakuza guy is also another founding person. There's also a civil war going on because a guy called Kemp has taken up the Callous Rebellion banner, warranting the presence of the UN Protectorate SeaTac soldiers on Harlan's World. Lead SeaTac guy Carrera leads the investigation into the murder, along with his Wolf DNA sleeve team. The head of the government, daughter to the Harlan who helped found and name the planet, is unhappy with Carrera's presence. Kovac sort of enlists the help of the bounty hunter who brought him, Trep, before being captured by Carrera. By the way, I think the thing on Trep's head is supposed to be the DCOM command head thing that Sylvie had in the book. It seems to work more as a brain-based computer interface in the show, though. Kovac is to be publicly put to death for killing all the people who died of this mysterious burning out thing. He fights with people augmented to look like people from his past, eventually being saved by Kel, who somehow got over being exploded in Season 1. Kovac is happy to see Kel again, but she's got a case of the amnesias. Lucky for her, it spared her fighting skills. He wants to get her off-world because she loses control and blacks out when murdering 1%ers. Given that Kovac is on the loose and Kel is apparently back, Carrera is given the go-ahead to spin up the back-upped version of Kovac to send off against modern Kovac. Kovac and company leave the city and head for the rebellion's old stronghold, with Clone Vach and some of Carrera's soldiers in pursuit. Kovac and friends are able to defeat Clone Vach's unit with the help of the rebellion, but spare Clone Vach. While at the stronghold, Kel gets her memory back. In addition to backing up her own file in exchange for selling out the rebellion, Rylene also backed up Kel's file. Rylene apparently then went through the trouble and expense of cloning Kel's original sleeve, sticking her consciousness into it, and then sticking her in a cryopod so she could torture her forever. This cryopod was stored underneath the stronghold because it would be the last place anyone would look. Apparently. Clone Vach and Kel have several moments, and he appears to switch sides. At some point, Kempists, members of the new Callous Rebellion, happen upon Kel, but accidentally infect themselves with something from the roots of the Songspire tree shown so prominently in Season 1. It kills them, but Kel is able to somehow not be killed by it. Plot twist back at the present. Rebellion leader Kemp was working for Harlan all along, and the revived rebellion itself wasn't real. Harlan just wanted to be able to seize complete control of the government. Kovac and friends escape the destruction of the people who thought they were in the rebellion, honestly, and ultimately get away because Kel calls down an orbital strike that kills the pursuing soldiers. Clone Vach is left behind and falls back in with Carrera. At some point, we find out that Carrera is actually Jaeger, Kovac's CEO, when he was in SeaTac. Carrera/Jaeger has an obsession with Kovac because he was such a good student and soldier, but betrayed him so thoroughly. But then the thing that infected Kel starts to kill her, so they do some virtual reality trickery to get the thing out of her head. This works, sort of, except Kel comes to and tells them they fucked up because she'd made a deal with it. The thing was an alien broodmother who'd been watching a clutch of eggs that were hidden there, but then the founding guys came in, saw the eggs, and went smashy smashy because they couldn't colonize an inhabited world. Somehow, the alien was able to pass her consciousness along, but would burn out hosts with her rage. Kel was able to contain her on the promise the alien would get its revenge, but only on the ones directly responsible. The unforeseen problem with their virtual reality trickery thing is that Clonevatch and Jaeger were also in the simulation, and Jaeger ends up infected with the broodmother. Alien-possessed Jaeger is now going to kill everyone on Harlan's world with the orbital satellites. Clonevatch is back on the good side, helping protect Trep while she blocks the alien's signal from going through, even though it didn't really seem to make a difference. Other plot twist. Harlan's dad, the founding Harlan, is dead and gone because she wanted to take over. Kel and Kovac make a plan to offer up what's left of the founding Harlan to the alien, but they're double-crossed by Harlan's daughter because she doesn't believe the alien would have been satisfied. She's killed for her trouble. Fight, fight, fight! Kel wants the alien to infect her so she can destroy herself and the alien with the orbital satellite because it might Dragon Age archdemon itself into another body otherwise. Kovac doesn't want Kel to die, so blocks her attempt at getting the alien, gets it himself, and then calls the orbital strike down on himself and gets destroyed. The day is saved. This series ends with Kel sending herself somewhere she's needed, and Clonevatch staying behind for governmental stability, but secretly planning on providing intel to Kel. Then we get a cliffhanger that Kovac isn't really dead. An AI character I haven't mentioned up till now backed him up at the last possible moment. The production quality of the second season didn't seem as solid as the first season. Like, the world felt smaller to me. Claustrophobic, even. Some sets or locations were reused from the first season. Makes sense, it's happening in some of the same places. But there's one alleyway that seemed like it was used anytime they needed an alley. Maybe if it had been dressed more differently, it wouldn't have stuck out or bothered me. The digital effects for this season felt more in line with a movie made by the Sci-Fi Channel than top-tier television. Granted, given the time constraints they had, it might have been the best they could conceivably do. But I would have rather had something equivalent in quality to the first season later than rushed and now. The text shown didn't seem as natural as in the first season. Trep's headgear and everyone's Oni, which is the little eyeball interface display thing, were a bit more clunky. The music didn't feel as special, and part of that's from recycling music from the first season, but normally that happening in a TV show evokes familiarity and the warm fuzzies, not annoyance. Let me give you an example of a difference with the music though. At the end of every Season 1 episode, there'd be a musical catch of some form and a corresponding visual hint at the next episode's content.
Ooh, death, just span me over another year.
The music eventually became muted, but by the final episode was back to a strong presence. In Season 2, there were no teasing visuals, just credits, and the music quickly became background noise. I didn't find the acting as strong in this season as in the first season. Like the first season, I hadn't seen most of the main actors act in anything. Brand me a Luddite if you will, but the last Marvel movie I saw, aside from the Deadpools, was the Avengers movie. The first one. So this was the first time I was seeing Anthony Mackie act. In my opinion, the actress who was the first sleeve appearance of Kovac in Season 2 felt like a better portrayal of Kovac than what was given by Mackie. I don't know if the snark and contained anger that I associate with Kovac isn't something that comes naturally to Mackie. Like I said, I haven't seen him in anything else. I didn't enjoy Mackie's portrayal of Kovac, but that may ultimately be a consequence of what he was given to work with and the direction he was given. The first exception was the previously mentioned nightclub singer Kovac, and the second is Carrera, played by Torben Liebrecht. It seemed like Liebrecht leaned into the weirdness of the character he'd been given and kinda went a bit hammy, but it worked. This really contrasted against the too cool for school, disaffected voice most of the other characters had throughout the show, and this wasn't present in the first season.
You seen Rab lately?
No. Why do you ask?
Because he usually comes in after a hack and grab. Emphasis on the hack.
The lighting design, cinematography, and directing were serviceable, but they didn't seem to be the same quality as in the first season. There is extensive use of the Dutch angle, and if there's one thing Battlefield Earth should have taught us, it's that you have to be sparing in their use. The camera movements can feel detached and unmotivated. It just kind of floats around half the time. The light composition is there. You can mostly see stuff, usually, but there wasn't the breathtaking shots like there was in the first season. I've blamed it a couple times already, and I'll do it again here. The writing didn't seem as tight or as effective as in the first season. One symptom of this is there was a greater reliance on telling instead of showing. And as a metric of this, I had a hard time staying awake watching the second season, and that didn't happen with the first. I understand that Netflix sort of set themselves up in a pickle story-wise for season 2. At the end of the first season, they set up that Kovac was going out pursuing Kel. And the second book doesn't really follow that at all. There's no Kel really, there's no Sarah, it's just its own little self-contained action story. So continuing the story thread that they started in season 1, it makes more sense for them to go for book 3. But besides some cool story beats and the location, the second season didn't follow the third book at all. And part of my displeasure with this is that I feel like those story beats were wasted. And it's not like they couldn't have done the third book properly. I was honestly expecting them to swap out the Revenge for Sarah plot thread for finding Kel. He could have been on Harlan's world, had something happen that led to him crossing paths with Sylvie, then roughly following the third book from there. He'd even find Kel eventually, and then there could be some stuff about getting her out of Sylvie's head or something. But no. There are so many large differences from the book to the screen adaptation that I'd have an even longer video if I went through and detailed them, so let's focus on a couple characters and story beats. The Kel in season 2 was a continuation of season 1's Kel, kinda. I dislike when stories use the laser-focused amnesia trope. Kel showing up with full combat skills intact but not remembering who she was or her rebellion? Ugh, lazy. You just know there's going to be something that shocks her memory back into her when it's convenient. So of course she magically gets it all back, partly because of true love. Now, I could see her deciding that her and Kovac were bad news together and trying to focus on their objective. That makes sense for who they wrote her to be. The bad guys for the season were mostly Harlan and some Carrera with the side of Clonevash. The bad guys for book 3 were mostly the Harlans and other wealthy elite with the side of Clonevash. They wanted to adapt the third book? Fine, cool, makes sense, go for it. So why did they start grabbing cool things from the second book? Leave Carrera, the Wedge, and their wolf DNA thing to the second book. Same with the costly Civil War, death vendors, and alien screams as a palpable force. Broken Angels is not something that's not adaptable. It would be an amazing standalone movie of some form, if the Netflix peeps hadn't come in and yoinked parts of the plot. But back to Carrera. They want to change a mercenary group into a group of government soldiers? Okay. And they're still under the command of Carrera. Fine. Why did they have to add this Jaeger connection? It was completely unnecessary. This added motivation for Carrera, that he had to get Kovac back because he was like a son to him or something? Really? Was this padding because they didn't have enough otherwise? Because it didn't really match what I remember of Jaeger in the first season. He was a military man who did seem to have some code of honor, even if it wasn't the best. Yeah, Jaeger was angry at Kovac for deserting. but there was some finality to it. Jaeger's reach was limited. It helped make who I'm assuming to be Sarah's death that much shittier. It was a waste of life to ultimately kick Kovac in the emotional shin. I'm sure the argument could be made that the time had changed and twisted him, but he ended up coming across as pretty unhinged even before the alien got in his head. He had to have been a huge liability for the Protectorate. The character we saw in the show was a better match for Book Carrera, so why the added weirdness of a Jaeger backstory for him? Why is Trep here? Was it because book fans were upset she wasn't used in the first season, so they used her here? And other than some character conservation, why does she have Sylvie's command head hardware? And why did they make it look so bad? So we get a Trep at the expense of a Sylvie. Seriously, I don't understand why we ended up with the story we did. There was so much to work with in the third book that wouldn't have taken a lot to fit in with what they'd done in season 1. Theme. What can I say about the theme for season 2? There is some remnant of the whole class divide thing, but Harlan seems more like a mustache-twirling villain than a character with depth. Something my husband kept coming back to with me when I was bouncing ideas off him for the script is if I have problems with the second season because I've read the books, or if there are legitimate problems with the season. I guess my answer for that is that the season was talked about and advertised as an adaptation of the third book. Adaptation. If Netflix had decided to sort of go their own way and tell their own story with the characters and whatever inspired by the Altered Carbon intellectual property, but hadn't lifted huge important plot points or characters from the second and third books, I'd have less of a problem with what they did with the story. But that's not what they did. Instead of a more direct adaptation of the third book, or a new story set in this universe, we end up with some weird amalgam of the two, and I feel like it's not as good as either of these contributing things could have been. This wasn't purely an adaptation issue, though. The budget definitely looks like it was lower for the second season, and the schedule may have been tighter, which would affect how much pre- and post-production time everyone would have had. That could then propagate to the writers not having as much time to finesse things, directors needing to go with safe shots that are guaranteed to work, and so forth. And I guess I'll end this video with a plea to Netflix. Altered Carbon, at least live action, might be a lost cause, but please don't do this to the second season of The Witcher.